This was the era of King Edward VII, a man who turned pleasure into statecraft and gave his name to an entire social order. He sat on the throne from 1901 to 1910, but his real reign had begun decades earlier, when he was still Prince of Wales and the undisputed architect of aristocratic indulgence. Edward had at least 55 documented mistresses, including the actress Lily Langtry, the indiscreet socialite Daisy Warwick, and the elegant Alice Keppel, who managed the affair with such flawless discretion that Queen Alexandra herself preferred her company. The king didn't hide his appetites. He celebrated them, and high society followed his lead like an obedient dance partner. The result was a world where infidelity wasn't whispered about in shame. It was mapped out on weekend guest lists, with bedroom assignments that just happened to place a lady in a room with a connecting corridor to a gentleman who was not her husband. Servants understood their role perfectly. They set out name cards on doors, rang a discreet bell at 6 in the morning, so lovers could slip back to their own beds before the maids arrived to light the fires, and kept their mouths firmly shut for the servants themselves. Of course, the rules were different. An illicit romance below stairs meant immediate dismissal, a brutal double standard that underlined the core requirement of this entire elegant machine: discretion. It was a system that worked beautifully, balancing public propriety with private liberty, as long as everyone remembered their lines. But here is the thing about a performance this intricate: sooner or later, someone forgets the script, a door opens at the wrong moment, and the entire illusion comes crashing down in a spectacle of ruin that no amount of country house etiquette can contain. To understand how this machine worked, you have to start with the man who built it. Before he was King Edward VII, he was simply Bertie, the Prince of Wales, a man who spent nearly 6 decades waiting for his mother Queen Victoria to vacate the throne. He filled those decades with an almost religious dedication to pleasure. His appetites were legendary: food, drink, cigars, and women. Always women. Historians have counted at least 55 mistresses, and those are only the ones they could document. There were likely dozens more, brief encounters in country houses or after dinners in Mayfair, recorded nowhere except in the knowing glances of servants who had long since learned to see nothing. The most important of these women fell into a careful hierarchy, as formal as any court ranking. First came the acknowledged mistresses, the ones society recognized and accepted. Lily Langtry was his first serious affair. She was a professional beauty and actress, born on the island of Jersey, who caught the prince's eye at a dinner party in 1877. She was married, of course. That was practically a requirement. An unmarried mistress would have been a scandal of an entirely different order. But a married woman, especially one with a compliant husband, was simply participating in the great unspoken arrangement. Lily and Bertie were inseparable for 3 years. He built her a house. He appeared with her at public events. Her husband conveniently traveled. It was all perfectly understood. Then came Daisy Brooke, later Daisy Greville, the Countess of Warwick. She was the second great mistress, and in many ways, she was the most dangerous. Where Lily was discreet, Daisy was a natural leak. Society nicknamed her the Babbling Brook, because her many clandestine affairs had a way of becoming public knowledge, usually through Daisy's own careless tongue. Her affair with the prince lasted 9 years, during which her husband inherited the earldom of Warwick, giving Daisy the rank she craved and the prince the cover of constant social proximity. She was beautiful, impulsive, and utterly incapable of keeping a secret. She was, in other words, a time bomb wrapped in silk. And then there was Alice Keppel, the great love of Edward's later life. She became his mistress in 1898, and she held that position until his death in 1910. Alice was the opposite of Daisy. She was discretion personified. Elegant, charming, and so tactful that even the prince's wife, Alexandra genuinely preferred her company. Alice lived at 30 Portman Square in London. Albert Edward, as the prince was formerly known, visited her there regularly. Her husband, the Honourable George Keppel, understood his role. When the future king called, George would quietly leave through a back entrance. No scenes, no accusations, just the smooth machinery of Edwardian marriage. The king later rewarded Alice not with direct payments, which would have been vulgar, but with shares in a rubber company that eventually netted her the equivalent of £7.5 million in today's money. Discretion paid extremely well. The prince's wife, Alexandra of Denmark, was herself a crucial piece of this architecture. She was not a fool. She knew everything, but she had made a calculation. Edward's infidelity was a fact of life, like the weather, and fighting it would only exhaust her and diminish her position. So she chose acceptance, with conditions. She welcomed selected mistresses into her social circle. She was gracious to Alice Keppel, even affectionate. The one mistress she truly disliked was Daisy Warwick, not because Daisy had been Edward's lover, but because Daisy lacked the grace to be subtle about it. Alexandra could forgive anything except bad manners. That, more than any moral judgment, tells you everything about the Edwardian soul. So the stage was set at the very top of society. The king, while still prince, had normalized the affair as a feature of aristocratic life, not a flaw. The queen had signaled her cooperation, and the hundreds of noble families who orbited the throne took careful note. If it was acceptable for the heir to the crown, then surely it was acceptable for them, as long as they followed the unwritten rules. And those rules were precise, elaborate, and enforced with more rigor than any law passed by Parliament. The first and most sacred rule was the production of an heir, and preferably a spare. This was non-negotiable. An aristocratic marriage was not a romantic union. It was a dynastic merger, designed to consolidate land, title, and bloodline. Love was a bonus found elsewhere, if at all. Once a wife had performed her primary biological duty and delivered at least one healthy son, the marital contract was considered fulfilled. After that point, both parties were permitted a great deal of private latitude, provided they observed the essential condition. Everything must remain invisible to the outside world. The appearance of respectability was everything. The reality could be whatever you liked. This is where the country house weekend became the central institution of Edwardian infidelity. These gatherings were ostensibly for hunting, shooting, fishing, and polite conversation. In practice, they were carefully orchestrated opportunities for sexual adventure. A typical party would include several couples, along with selected single gentlemen and the occasional young lady whose reputation was already secure enough to survive the weekend. The hostess, usually the lady of the house, held a position of immense tactical importance. It was her job to arrange the bedrooms. Now, this was not a matter of simply handing out keys. It was a diplomatic art form. Before the guests arrived, she would have received discreet communications. A note, perhaps, or a quiet word through a trusted lady's maid. Lord so-and-so and Lady such-and-such wish to be accommodated nearby. The hostess would study the floor plan of her house with the concentration of a general, planning a campaign. Bedrooms were assigned accordingly. The lady would be given a room with a door that opened conveniently onto a corridor that led, entirely coincidentally, to the gentleman's dressing room. Or perhaps their rooms would be connected by a shared sitting room, or a discreet back staircase that servants had been instructed not to use after midnight. The mechanics were well established. Once the guests retired for the evening, a strange migration would begin. Gentlemen in their dressing gowns would move through the darkened hallways, guided by memory, candlelight, or the name cards that thoughtful hostesses had slipped into brass holders on each door. These cards were not meant for the servants. The servants already knew who belonged where. The cards were for the guests themselves. To prevent the embarrassment of a wrong turn, the nightmare of climbing into bed with the wrong countess. A discreet bell was rung at 6 o'clock in the morning, early enough that the maids had not yet arrived to light the fires, late enough that everyone had presumably caught a few hours of sleep. At the sound of that bell, the gentlemen would rise, gather their scattered clothing, and return to their own rooms. By the time the household officially woke, every husband was where he was supposed to be. Every wife was alone in her own bed, and the night's activities had been erased as thoroughly as a chalk mark wiped from a slate. Servants were the silent backbone of this entire enterprise. They lit the candles, turned down the beds, placed the hot water bottles, and then made themselves conveniently absent. They knew who visited whom and for how long. They collected the notes passed between lovers at dinner. They emptied the chamber pots and laundered the sheets and never, ever spoke of what they saw. A servant who gossiped was dismissed instantly and without reference, which, in that world, meant economic ruin. A servant who conducted their own affair, even with another servant, was also dismissed, often the same day. The hypocrisy was breathtaking and entirely intentional. The rules that governed the masters had nothing whatsoever to do with the rules that governed the staff. Discretion was not a virtue. It was a privilege of rank. The system, when it worked, was a marvel of social engineering. It allowed the aristocracy to maintain the public facade of Christian morality while privately indulging almost any appetite. It kept families intact, property consolidated, and scandal at bay. It even managed to generate a kind of strange camaraderie among those in the know. Husbands and their wives' lovers often became cordial acquaintances, sharing a cigar after dinner or partnering at bridge. To make a scene, to demand fidelity, or confront a rival was the true social crime. It was not the affair that ruined you. It was being indiscreet about it. In fact, the only unforgivable sin in the Edwardian playbook was public embarrassment. As long as the surface remained unbroken, the depths could seethe with whatever passions they pleased. But a system that depends on everyone keeping quiet is only as strong as its weakest link. And the Edwardian aristocracy was full of weak links. Daisy Warwick, the babbling brook, was the most conspicuous example. She simply could not stop talking. At a party, over cards, in a letter to a friend, she would let slip some detail that made it clear she was far more intimate with the prince than protocol allowed. Society absorbed these indiscretions for years, but each one was a crack in the edifice. Daisy also had a habit of threatening to publish her memoirs or reveal letters when her finances grew tight, a form of emotional blackmail that caused the palace endless anxiety. She kept the letters the prince had written her, dozens of them, locked in a box that represented a bomb beneath the throne. Meanwhile, the press was beginning to change. During most of Queen Victoria's reign, newspapers had maintained a voluntary code of silence about the private lives of the powerful. But by the late 1890s, a new kind of journalism was emerging, hungrier, less deferential, more aware that scandal sold papers. The Daily Mail had been founded in 1896 and was rapidly building a mass readership. The old compact, in which editors looked the other way, was starting to fray. The aristocracy did not yet realize how vulnerable they had become. They continued to play their games behind closed doors, confident that those doors would hold. They were about to discover their mistake. The first great warning came not from a bedroom, but from a card table. In September of 1890, the Prince of Wales was a guest at Tranby Croft, a country house in Yorkshire belonging to a wealthy shipbuilder named Arthur Wilson. It was a racing weekend, and after the day's events, the party gathered for a game of baccarat, an illegal gambling game that was popular in aristocratic circles precisely because it was forbidden. The prince, as was his custom, sat as banker. Among the players was a man named Sir William Gordon Cumming, a baronet and decorated army officer. As the game progressed, another guest who had been watching became convinced that Gordon Cumming was cheating. What followed was a nightmare of whispered conferences and agonized decisions. The accusation was made privately, behind closed doors. The other guests agreed to confirm it. Gordon Cumming, facing ruin, signed a document promising never to play cards again, on the condition that everyone present promised to keep the matter absolutely secret. The Prince of Wales himself gave his word, and then, as always happens with secrets that powerful people desperately want to keep, it leaked. The story reached the newspapers. Gordon Cumming sued for slander to clear his name, and the Prince of Wales was compelled to appear as a witness in open court. The first time the heir to the British throne had been put in a witness box in over a century. The trial was a sensation. The courtroom was packed. The press coverage was relentless. The details of the illegal gambling party, the whispered accusation, the private document, all of it was spread across the front pages of every newspaper in the country. Gordon Cumming lost his case. He was dismissed from the army and expelled from society. The Times declared, quote, "He has committed a mortal offense. Society can know him no more." The prince survived, but his reputation was badly damaged. Public opinion turned sharply against him. For several years, he was booed at public events, and the monarchy itself seemed tarnished. The Tranby Croft scandal demonstrated, for the first time, that the wall between private indulgence and public exposure was not nearly as solid as the aristocracy had assumed. The door had opened, and on the other side of that door, a new world was waiting. One that would not be satisfied with whispered rumors and 6 o'clock bells. The aristocrats absorbed the Tranby Croft humiliation, learned a few lessons, and then went straight back to their weekend parties. The system was too deeply embedded, too convenient, and frankly too enjoyable to abandon because one cheat got caught at cards. Besides, Edward himself, now king, showed no sign of reforming. If anything, the crown on his head made him bolder. He had Alice Keppel installed as his semi-official companion, appearing with her at society events and on holidays in Biarritz. The public knew, the court knew, the empire knew, and nobody dared say a word. So, if the king could flaunt his mistress with such serene confidence, why should anyone else restrain themselves? The message from the top was clear. The rules of the game had not changed. Only the stakes had. The country house party, the great engine of Edwardian adultery, reached its peak of sophistication in these years. These gatherings were not spontaneous events. They were meticulously planned operations, sometimes weeks in advance, with an attention to detail that would impress a military quartermaster. The guest list was the first consideration. A well-balanced house party required a mix of couples, unattached gentlemen, and perhaps a widow or two whose social position was unassailable and whose silence could be guaranteed. The hostess's task was to ensure that the correct pairs could form without overt matchmaking. She would never explicitly suggest an affair. That would be vulgar. Instead, she created the conditions under which an affair could flourish, like a gardener preparing soil. The physical layout of the house itself was often a silent conspirator. Many of the great country estates had been built or renovated during the Victorian and Edwardian periods with, let us say, an acute understanding of human nature. There were corridors that led nowhere except from one bedroom to another. There were dressing rooms with 2 doors, one to the main hallway and one, purely for ventilation of course, to the neighboring chamber. Some houses featured hidden staircases tucked behind paneling, originally built for servants but repurposed by generations of guests for entirely different traffic. The most sophisticated houses even had a system of bells and speaking tubes that allowed discreet communication between rooms, theoretically for summoning a maid, but equally useful for arranging a rendezvous without ever committing anything to paper. Upon arrival at a country house, a guest would find their bedroom already assigned. The luggage had been delivered, the fire lit, the bed turned down. On the door or on the dressing table would be a small card bearing their name. This was the famous name card, a simple object that carried immense significance. Its ostensible purpose was to prevent guests from wandering into the wrong room after a long evening of port and politics. Its actual purpose was to serve as a map of the night's possibilities. A gentleman who wished to visit a particular lady had only to read her name on the door, and if the hostess had done her job correctly, that door would be within easy walking distance of his own, down a corridor that the other guests had no reason to use. The servants had already memorized the layout. They knew which rooms were occupied by which guests, and they knew which doors they should avoid knocking on after 10 o'clock. The evening itself followed a comforting, predictable rhythm. Dinner was served at 8 or half past, a long, lavish affair with multiple courses, fine wines, and conversation that danced carefully around the immense facts that everyone in the room was pretending to ignore. A husband might sit next to his wife's lover and discuss the hunting prospects for the following day. A wife might compliment her husband's mistress on her gown. The atmosphere was one of impeccable courtesy, a collective agreement that the surface would remain unbroken. After dinner, the ladies would withdraw to the drawing room, leaving the gentlemen to their port and, if they wished, to a quiet exchange of information: who was staying in which room, which corridor was safe, and whether the bell would be at 6 or perhaps, if the hostess was feeling generous, at 6:30. When the gentlemen rejoined the ladies, the evening continued with cards, music, or billiards. The real drama, however, was unfolding beneath the polite chatter. Glances were exchanged, notes passed, subtle arrangements confirmed. A folded slip of paper pressed into a palm during a handshake. A whispered sentence behind the cover of a particularly loud piano piece. By the time the party retired for the night, usually around 11, every interested party knew exactly where they were going and how to get there. The migration began once the house had fallen quiet. Gentlemen would wait in their rooms, listening for the creak of floorboards that signaled the servants had finally retreated to their own quarters below stairs. Then, with a candle or a dark lantern, each man would make his way through the silent corridors. The name cards glowed faintly in the candlelight, guiding him like a lighthouse. If all went as planned, he would tap softly on the designated door. It would open, and he would step inside. Within half an hour, the house that had seemed so peacefully asleep was, in reality, a hive of private activity, conducted in whispers and shadows. The 6 o'clock bell was the great equalizer. At the sound of that bell, the gentlemen would rise, dress as quickly and quietly as they had undressed, and retrace their steps. They would pass other gentlemen in the hallways, men they had dined with the evening before. No words would be exchanged. A nod, perhaps, a slight smile, nothing more. By the time the maids arrived to draw the curtains and light the fires, every husband was in his own bed, every wife was alone, and the only evidence of the night's activities was the occasional tie left on a chair, or a misplaced cufflink that would later be discreetly returned by a lady's maid. This was the heart of the Edwardian affair system, not secrecy, but deniability. Everyone knew what was happening. The servants knew. The other guests knew. The participants knew that everyone else knew. But because no one ever spoke of it, because the forms were always observed, the polite world could continue to function as though it believed its own mythology. It was a form of mass self-deception that required enormous energy to maintain, and it was maintained with astonishing success for decades. Husbands in this arrangement were expected to play a particular role. They were to be either oblivious or complicit, whichever was more convenient. Many chose complicity. It was not uncommon for a husband and his wife's lover to develop a cordial relationship, ununited by their shared investment in the woman's happiness and, more practically, her silence. A husband who accepted the situation gracefully would find his own indiscretions similarly tolerated. A husband who made a scene, who challenged a lover to a duel or filed for divorce, would find himself the social pariah. He would be the one whose name was dropped from guest lists. He would be the one whispered about in drawing rooms. The affair was not the crime. The exposure was the crime. And the husband who exposed it was as guilty as the lovers he exposed. This logic extended to wives as well. A wife who had produced the requisite heir and spare had, in the eyes of society, fulfilled her primary obligation. What she did after that was her own affair, provided she was discreet. Some wives embraced the system with enthusiasm. Others suffered in silence. A few, astonishingly, remained genuinely in love with their husbands and faithful to them, an arrangement that was regarded with a kind of puzzled respect, as though they had chosen to live without indoor plumbing. The system was flexible enough to accommodate all types, as long as everyone agreed to play by the same rules. Servants were the silent engine of this world. A great country house employed dozens of them: butlers, housekeepers, footmen, ladies' maids, valet, housemaids, kitchen maids, scullery maids. They rose before dawn and worked until long after dark, and they saw everything. They knew which beds had been slept in by more than one person. They collected the notes, the forgotten gloves, the discarded corks from midnight champagne. They emptied the slops and laundered the linen, and they formed a vast, invisible network of witnesses who could, if they chose, destroy the reputations of everyone upstairs. They did not choose. The consequences were too severe. A servant who gossiped would be dismissed without a character reference, which meant they would never work in a respectable house again. Economic annihilation was the punishment for telling the truth, yet the servant's silence came at a price, and that price was often paid in the currency of resentment. While the aristocracy upstairs conducted their elaborate love affairs, the servants downstairs were held to a standard of absolute chastity. A housemaid who became pregnant, even by a fellow servant, even by a son of the house who had pressured her, was dismissed instantly. No allowance made for circumstance, no consideration of the power dynamics involved. The hypocrisy was naked, and it was deliberate. The rules existed to protect the powerful, not to enforce a consistent morality. And the resentment this generated, the slow accumulation of anger in the servants' halls and the kitchen stairs, would eventually find its outlet. But that was still to come. The system, for all its sophistication, had a fundamental weakness. It relied on the cooperation of everyone involved, and that included people who were not always reliable. Daisy Warwick, the Countess of Warwick, and the Prince's former mistress, was the most spectacular example of this unreliability. She had been Edward's lover for nearly a decade, and she had accumulated a dangerous quantity of evidence, letters. Dozens of them, written in the prince's hand, and containing sentiments that were, to put it mildly, not intended for public consumption. Edward had been a passionate letter writer, and in the heat of his affair with Daisy, he had committed to paper things that could, if revealed, shake the monarchy to its foundations. Daisy kept these letters. She kept them through the end of the affair, through Edward's ascension to the throne, and through the mounting costs of her own extravagant lifestyle. Daisy was perpetually short of money. Her husband's estate was large but burdened with debt, and Daisy herself had an inability to economize that was, even by aristocratic standards, impressive. The letters represented an asset, and as the years passed, she began to treat them as such. She never publicly threatened to publish them, but she let it be known, through carefully placed intermediaries, that they existed and that their continued security might depend on the settlement of certain financial obligations. It was blackmail, conducted with the exquisite politeness of a society drawing room, and it was terrifyingly effective. The palace was frantic. Edward's private secretary, a man named Francis Knollys, spent years trying to retrieve the letters. He negotiated, he pleaded, he paid. Daisy, for her part, played the game with skill. She would agree to return a batch of letters, receive a sum of money, and then, a few years later, discover another batch that she had apparently forgotten. The palace never knew if they had secured everything or if there were still letters out there, ticking like bombs in a drawer somewhere in Warwick Castle. The anxiety was permanent, and it poisoned the relationship between the king and his former mistress for the rest of his life. But if Daisy was a problem, she was a manageable one. She was, after all, a member of the club. She understood the rules, even if she bent them. The real threat to the Edwardian system came not from within the aristocracy, but from outside. It, from a world that did not respect the old codes and was not content to whisper. That world was the popular press. Newspapers had existed for centuries, but the press as a mass medium, with millions of readers and an insatiable appetite for scandal, was a product of the late Victorian and Edwardian periods. The repeal of the stamp duty on newspapers in the mid-19th century had lowered prices. The expansion of literacy had created a vast new readership, and the rise of sensational journalism, pioneered by papers like the Pall Mall Gazette and later the Daily Mail, had demonstrated that scandal sold. The old compact, in which newspapers respected the privacy of the powerful in exchange for access, was breaking down. Editors were no longer gentlemen. They were businessmen, and they understood that the intimate details of an aristocratic love affair would sell more copies than a dozen political speeches. The aristocracy was slow to recognize this shift. They had grown up in a world where the press was deferential and discreet, where a gentleman could expect his private life to remain private as long as he was not caught in a public embarrassment. They did not understand that the definition of public embarrassment was expanding. The Tranby-Croft scandal of 1890 had been a warning, but it could be dismissed as an aberration, a case that involved the heir to the throne and could not be ignored. What came next was worse, because it was not about the prince. It was about ordinary aristocrats, caught in the new glare of the tabloid sun. The case of Lady Charles Beresford, which involved Daisy Warwick and a letter, was the moment the system truly began to crack. Lady Charles was the wife of Lord Charles Beresford, a naval officer and a popular figure in society. Daisy Warwick, who had been intimate with Lord Charles before her affair with the prince, had written him a letter that contained, among other things, some very candid observations about her own situation. The letter was emotional, indiscreet, and potentially devastating. Lady Charles got hold of it, and she was not prepared to play by the old rules. Daisy, realizing that the letter in the wrong hands could destroy her, did what any sensible person in her position would do. She went to the Prince of Wales. Bertie, as she still called him, understood the danger immediately. He went to Lady Charles and made it clear, in the most gentlemanly possible terms, that if she ever used that letter, it would be she, not Daisy, who would be ostracized by society. This was the old system in action, the powerful closing ranks, the threat of social death, wielded like a weapon. And for a while, it worked. Lady Charles kept the letter and kept quiet. But the incident had a long tail. The Beresford family did not forget. Lord Charles, furious at the prince's interference, threatened to horsewhip him. A scandal was only narrowly averted through a flurry of diplomatic efforts. The prince was forced to apologize, an almost unheard-of humiliation, and the whole affair left a sour taste in the mouth of society. The machinery of discretion, which was supposed to run smoothly and silently, had been exposed to view. People were beginning to talk, not just in drawing rooms, but in the pages of newspapers that were increasingly willing to print what they heard. The Beresford letter affair was a turning point. Although few recognized it at the time, it demonstrated that the system could not always contain its own contradictions. A woman like Daisy Warwick, charming but careless, could create a problem that even the Prince of Wales could not solve. A woman like Lady Charles Beresford, wronged and angry, could refuse to accept the polite hypocrisy that was supposed to govern her behavior. The old order depended on everyone accepting their assigned role. But the more people who refused to accept those roles, the more fragile the order became. By the early years of Edward's reign, the strain was beginning to show. The king himself was aging, his health undermined by decades of heavy living. His relationship with Alice Keppel remained steady, a fixed point in a shifting world. But around him, the social landscape was changing. The newspapers were growing bolder, the public was growing more curious, and the younger generation of aristocrats, raised in a world of greater freedom and less deference, were less willing to maintain the elaborate fictions that their parents had sustained. The country house parties continued, of course. The name cards still appeared on the doors. The 6 o'clock bell still rang. But the confidence that had once characterized these rituals was gone. There was a new nervousness in the air, a sense that the old invisibility was no longer guaranteed. A servant might talk, a rival might leak a story, a journalist might go undercover, posing as a guest or bribing a footman. The walls that had once protected the aristocracy from public scrutiny were developing cracks, and through those cracks, light was beginning to pour in. But before we see the walls come down entirely, there is one more story to tell. It is the story of the most remarkable affair of the Edwardian era, a relationship that operated so smoothly, with such perfect discretion, that it seemed to prove the system could work forever. That affair was between Alice Keppel and the king, and its perfection was, in its own way, the greatest illusion of all. Because beneath the surface of that impeccable arrangement, forces were gathering that would soon sweep everything away, and not even Alice Keppel, with all her tact and charm, could hold them back. The king was dying, and when he went, the world that had protected his pleasures would die with him, leaving everyone who had depended on it exposed to the cold, unforgiving light of a new century. The king died on the 6th of May 1910 at Buckingham Palace. He was 68 years old, and he had reigned for only 9 years, but his true reign, the reign of pleasure and polite hypocrisy, had shaped British society for 4 decades. His final illness was sudden, a series of heart attacks, what the doctors called cardiac exhaustion, brought on by a lifetime of cigars, rich food, and the accumulated stress of a double life that was not really double, merely divided into compartments. As he lay dying, Queen Alexandra, who had borne his infidelities with stoic grace for nearly half a century, did something extraordinary. She summoned Alice Keppel to his bedside. The wife invited the mistress to say goodbye. Alice came, stayed briefly, and left, her face composed, her dignity intact. The king died a few hours later, surrounded by his family and, in the room next door, the woman he had loved for 12 years. It was a final act of Edwardian theatre, exquisitely scripted, perfectly performed, and utterly impossible to sustain in the world that would follow. Because the world was already changing. Even before the king drew his last breath, the new king, George V, was a very different man. Where his father had been warm, indulgent, and expansive, George was reserved, rigid, and deeply conventional. He had loved his father, but he had also been embarrassed by him. George was determined to restore the dignity of the monarchy, and that meant sweeping away the old arrangements. The mistresses were dismissed, politely but firmly. Alice Keppel understood. She had always understood the rules. She retreated to her husband, to her comfortable house in London, and to the fortune she had accumulated from the rubber shares the king had given her. Years before, she would live until 1947, a relic of a vanished age, watching her former world crumble from the safety of a royal pensioner's obscurity. Her daughter, Violet, would later become the lover of Vita Sackville West and a central figure in the Bloomsbury Group. a twist of history that Alice, for all her sophistication, could never have anticipated. But the real danger was not Alice Keppel, it was Daisy Warwick. Daisy, alone among the king's mistresses, had never learned the art of letting go. She had the letters, dozens of them, written in the king's hand, filled with the kind of emotional candor that an older, wiser man would never have committed to paper. For years, she had used them as a silent insurance policy, extracting funds from the palace through discreet intermediaries. As long as Edward was alive, the money had flowed. But now Edward was dead, and the new king was not inclined to be generous. Daisy was facing bankruptcy. Her estate at Easton Lodge was crumbling. Her debts were mounting, and her reputation, already tarnished by years of indiscretion, offered her no protection. She made a decision that would have been unthinkable a generation earlier. She decided to sell the letters. In 1914, 4 years after the king's death, Daisy approached an American publisher and offered to sell her memoirs, complete with the royal correspondence, for a sum that would have cleared her debts and allowed her to live in comfort. For the rest of her life, the news reached Buckingham Palace like a shell explosion. George V, who had spent his reign trying to expunge the memory of his father's scandals, was suddenly confronted with the possibility that the entire record would be published for the world to read. The palace lawyers were mobilized. The palace agents were dispatched. The palace checkbook was opened. A deal was struck. Daisy would receive a substantial payment, and in return, the letters would be suppressed. The scandal was averted, barely, but the damage was done. The story had leaked, as stories always do. The papers had gotten wind of it, and although they could not publish the letters themselves, they could publish the fact that there had been letters, and that the palace had paid to suppress them. The implication was clear: the monarchy had been blackmailed by a former mistress, and the public was left to imagine what the letters contained. The Warwick affair was a watershed. It marked the moment when the old system of discretion ceased to be a matter of honor and became a matter of money. The aristocrats who had once guarded their secrets through mutual obligation now found that those secrets had a price, and there were people willing to pay it. The newspapers, particularly the new mass circulation dailies, were those people. They had discovered that scandal sold, and they were no longer willing to accept the gentleman's agreement that had kept the private lives of the powerful out of print. The Daily Mail, founded in 1896, had built a circulation of nearly 1 million by 1900, and its proprietor, Lord Northcliffe, understood that his readers wanted stories about the real lives of the rich and titled, not the sanitized accounts they read in society pages, but the truth, the affairs, the debts, the betrayals, the secrets whispered behind bedroom doors. Northcliffe's reporters began to cultivate sources among servants, among disgruntled former lovers, among anyone who had a grievance and a story to tell. The result was a slow, steady erosion of the wall that had separated public and private life. One by one, scandals that would once have been smothered in silence began to surface in print. The names were sometimes concealed with dashes or initials, but everyone knew who was meant. A certain countess was seen leaving a hotel with a man who was not her husband. A certain marquess was paying for a flat in Mayfair occupied by a chorus girl. A certain baronet was habitually drunk in public and had to be carried home by his servants. The details were titillating, but the cumulative effect was corrosive. The aristocracy, which had once seemed so distant and so enviable, began to look merely human, and not in an attractive way. They looked greedy, hypocritical, self-indulgent, and absurd. The pedestal on which they had stood was cracking, and the press was wielding the hammer. But the press, for all its power, was only one force at work. There was another force, deeper and more inexorable, that was dismantling the Edwardian social order from within. That force was the war. When the First World War broke out in August 1914, the country house parties stopped. The men who had spent their summers hunting and shooting and moving through darkened corridors now put on uniforms and went to France. Many of them did not come back. The great estates, deprived of their heirs and their laborers, began a long decline that would accelerate through the 1920s and 30s. The servant armies that had made the system possible were decimated by conscription and by the new opportunities that war offered for work in factories and offices. The old invisible network of silent witnesses was broken. The rituals of the Edwardian affair, with their name cards and their 6 o'clock bells, came to seem not merely decadent but irrelevant, a relic of a world that had been swept away by machine guns and mud. When the war ended, the survivors returned to a country that had changed beyond recognition. The deference that had sustained the aristocracy for centuries had been shattered. Men who had fought in the trenches were not inclined to bow and scrape to a lord who had spent the war safely behind a desk. Women who had worked in factories and hospitals while the men were away were not inclined to return to a life of drawing rooms and supervised courtship. The moral climate shifted. The old double standard, which had allowed husbands to stray while wives were expected to be faithful, began to be questioned openly. Divorce, once a scandal reserved for the most extreme cases, became more common, and the newspapers covered every case with relish. It was in this new climate that the true vulnerability of the Edwardian system was exposed. For decades, the arrangement had worked because everyone had agreed to play by the same rules. But now, the rules had changed, and the players who had once been protected by the old code found themselves judged by the new one. The women who had conducted their affairs with the permission, however grudging, of their husbands and their society, were suddenly vulnerable. Their letters could be subpoenaed in divorce courts. Their reputations could be destroyed by a single newspaper article. Their lovers, who had once felt bound by a code of mutual protection, now proved less reliable. The men, for the most part, escaped the worst of the fallout. A divorced husband might lose some money, might be excluded from a few drawing rooms, but his career was not ruined. His social standing was not annihilated. For a divorced wife, the consequences were catastrophic. She could lose her children, her home, her income, and her place in society. The double standard, which had always existed, was now enforced not by whispered gossip, but by the full machinery of the law and the press. The case of Lady Colin Campbell, though it occurred slightly earlier, in 1886, set the template. She had been accused of adultery by her husband, and although she was acquitted, the trial destroyed her reputation. She was ostracized by society, cut off from her family, and forced to support herself as a journalist. Her husband, meanwhile, went on with his political career as though nothing had happened. The pattern was repeated again and again in the early decades of the 20th century. A wife was accused, a trial was held, the newspapers printed every lurid detail, and the woman was ruined. The man, in the rare cases where he was named, might suffer a temporary embarrassment, but he was rarely destroyed. The society that had winked at adultery for decades suddenly discovered a rigid morality, and it applied that morality most severely to the women who had trusted the old system to protect them. Nowhere was this more visible than in the fate of the women who had been involved with the highest figures in the land. Daisy Warwick, despite her blackmail attempts, retained some of her social standing, but she was never fully trusted again. She spent her later years campaigning for socialist causes, a conversion that some saw as genuine and others saw as an attempt to salvage her reputation through good works. Alice Keppel, by contrast, maintained her discretion until the end. She never spoke of the king, never published a memoir, never revealed a single intimate detail. Her reward was a peaceful old age and a place in history as the most successful royal mistress of the modern era. But she was the exception. For every Alice Keppel who navigated the transition with grace, There were a dozen women whose lives were wrecked by the collapse of the old order. The men, as always, fared better. The Prince of Wales, later Edward VIII, would conduct a very public affair with a married American woman, Wallis Simpson, and the scandal would cost him his throne. But even in abdication, he was not ruined. He married the woman he loved, lived in comfort, and remained a figure of public fascination until his death. The double standard held firm. A king could give up his crown for love and be remembered as romantic. A woman who did far less could lose everything and be remembered only as a cautionary tale. The Edwardian system of polite adultery had been, in its own way, a masterpiece of social engineering. It had allowed the aristocracy to enjoy the pleasures of the flesh while maintaining the facade of respectability. It had kept families intact, estates unbroken, and scandal at bay. But it had depended on a set of conditions that could not last. It needed a king who modeled the behavior and enforced the code. It needed a press that was willing to look the other way. It needed a servant class that was too frightened to speak. And it needed a public that was sufficiently deferential to accept the official version of reality. By 1920, every one of those conditions had been destroyed. The king was dead, the press was ravenous, the servants were gone, and the public had seen too much to believe the old lies any longer. The tabloid culture that emerged in the 1920s was the direct heir of the Edwardian newspaper revolution. Papers like the Daily Express and the Daily Mirror, following the trail blazed by the Daily Mail, turned the private lives of the aristocracy into a form of mass entertainment. Every divorce, every affair, every hint of scandal was splashed across the front pages. The old code of silence was replaced by a code of exposure, and the public appetite for revelation seemed insatiable. The aristocracy, which had once feared nothing more than being talked about, now found itself talked about constantly, and not in the way it would have chosen. This was the world that ended the era of polite hypocrisy, not the world of the drawing room and the country house, but the world of the news agent and the popular newspaper. The secrets that had once been guarded by a network of loyal servants were now sold to the highest bidder. The whispered rumors that had once circulated only in society were now printed in black and white for millions to read. The discreet arrangements that had once governed the sleeping quarters of a country house were replaced by the public spectacle of the divorce court, and the women who had trusted the system were left to pay the price, while the men who had built the system and benefited from it moved on as though nothing had happened. But the story does not end there. Because the final reckoning was not merely social, it was political. The erosion of aristocratic prestige that began with the scandal sheets would eventually contribute to the broader democratic transformation of British society. The idea that the ruling class was morally unfit to rule, nourished by decades of revelations about their private conduct, would weaken their hold on power. The old deference that had sustained the aristocracy for centuries would be replaced by a new skepticism, a new willingness to judge their betters, not by their manners, but by their behavior. The polite affair, that intricate dance of desire and discretion, had always been more than a personal matter. It had been a pillar of the social order, and when that pillar crumbled, the whole edifice began to sway. The question that remains, the question that will carry us into the final act of this story, is what happened when the edifice finally fell. Who was standing when the dust cleared, and what did the survivors learn about the price of living behind closed doors? The answers lie in the stories of the men and women who lived through the collapse, and in the strange, unexpected ways they tried to rebuild their world from the ruins. Some of them succeeded, others did not, and one of them left behind a secret so devastating that it would not come to light for decades, a secret that would force even the most cynical observer to reconsider everything they thought they knew about the Edwardian age and its polite, hypocritical, exquisitely arranged affairs. The edifice crumbled slowly at first, then all at once. The men who had once moved so confidently through those darkened country house corridors found themselves in a world that no longer respected the old maps. Some of them adapted, many of them did not. And the women who had trusted the system to protect them, learned just how fragile that protection had been. Their stories are the ones that matter most, because they paid the price for everyone's hypocrisy. Let's start with the survivors, and then we'll talk about the secret that would take a century to surface, the one that would rewrite everything we thought we knew about the most discreet affair of the Edwardian age. Alice Keppel was the gold standard of survival. After the king's death in 1910, she retreated to her comfortable house in London and to the large fortune she had accumulated through those rubber shares. She never spoke a word about her years with Edward. Not a memoir, not an interview, not a single indiscreet sentence to a dinner companion. Her husband George, who had played the role of compliant cuckold with such silent grace, died in 1914, and Alice remained a widow for the rest of her life. She traveled, she entertained, she watched her daughters grow into the kind of women she had never allowed herself to be: bohemian, outspoken, unafraid. Her eldest daughter, Violet, became the lover of the writer Vita Sackville-West and a central figure in the Bloomsbury Group. A world of frank sexuality and creative genius that must have seemed like another planet to her mother. Alice never judged. She had learned, in the crucible of the Edwardian court, that love took many forms and that silence was almost always the wisest policy. She died in 1947 at the age of 79, a relic of a vanished era, still holding the secrets of the royal bedroom. Daisy Warwick, by contrast, had a much harder landing. After the king's death, her financial situation went from bad to catastrophic. The blackmail payments stopped. The estate at Easton Lodge was crumbling, and Daisy's creditors were circling. She tried to sell her memoirs once more in 1929, this time to a British publisher, but the palace lawyers descended again, and the deal fell through. Desperate and radicalized by her own decline, Daisy turned to socialism. She became a vocal campaigner for the Labour Party, endorsed by the very establishment she had once charmed. The society columns treated her conversion as a curiosity, a rich woman playing at politics. But Daisy was serious. She genuinely believed the old order had failed, and she spent her last years writing pamphlets, giving speeches, and trying to convince her fellow aristocrats that their day was done. They didn't listen, of course. Most of them regarded her as a traitor to her class, a woman who had traded her pearls for a soapbox. Daisy died in 1938, and her obituaries were a study in polite condescension. The babbling brook had finally run dry, and society heaved a collective sigh of relief. Lily Langtry, the first great mistress, had already transformed herself into a successful actress and businesswoman. She had never relied on royal patronage alone, and when the affair ended, she simply continued her career. She married a second time, to a man 19 years her junior, and spent her later years in Monaco, far from the English drawing rooms that had once gossiped about her. She died in 1929, and by then the world had largely forgotten that she had once been the object of a future king's obsession. In the grand sweep of history, she had become merely a footnote, a name in a list of royal mistresses, her actual life reduced to a single scandalous chapter. That was the fate of most of these women. Not tragedy, exactly, but erasure. The men they had loved were remembered as charismatic, powerful, complex. The women were remembered only as the lovers of great men, their own stories reduced to a single transgression. The double standard was never more obvious than in the divorce courts of the 1920s and 30s. Every season brought a fresh crop of cases, each one more lurid than the last, and the newspapers covered them with the same breathless enthusiasm they had once reserved for royal jubilees. The pattern was always the same. A husband, wishing to remarry, would hire private detectives to catch his wife in a compromising situation. The evidence would be presented in court, often in excruciating detail. The newspapers would print every word, and the wife's reputation would be annihilated. She would lose her children, her home, her income, and her social standing. The husband, meanwhile, would marry his younger mistress and continue his career unimpeded. It was a form of legalized cruelty, and it was applied almost exclusively to women. A man could be caught in a dozen affairs and still be received in the best houses. A woman caught once was finished. The women who survived the divorce courts intact were the ones who had learned the lessons of the Edwardian era, discretion above all. They had kept no letters, written no confessions, burned every scrap of evidence the moment it was read. They had trusted no one, not even their lovers. And when the axe fell, they were left with nothing to incriminate themselves. But even they paid a price. The constant vigilance, the perpetual fear of exposure, the knowledge that one careless moment could destroy everything. It exacted a psychological toll that was never acknowledged and never compensated. They had been trained to smile through dinner parties while their hearts were breaking, to welcome their husbands' mistresses into their homes, to pretend that everything was fine when nothing was fine. That training served them well in the new era, but it also hollowed them out. The men, for the most part, sailed through the wreckage with remarkable ease. A divorced aristocrat might lose some money, might be asked to resign from a club or two, but his career was not over. His future was not foreclosed. He could marry again, have more children, and as long as he remained outwardly respectable, his past was politely overlooked. The hypocrisy was staggering, and everyone knew it, but the power to enforce the double standard remained firmly in male hands. The judges were men, the politicians were men, the newspaper editors were men. The moral economy of British society had been built by men, for men, and when it came time to apportion blame, the women were always assigned the larger share. The decline of the great country houses mirrored the decline of the aristocracy itself. As the 20s gave way to the 30s, estate after estate was sold, demolished, or donated to the National Trust. The vast servant armies that had once made the house parties possible were gone, dispersed by war and social change. The houses that remained were haunted by the ghosts of their former splendor. Ballrooms that had once echoed with the music of string quartets stood empty, their chandeliers dimmed. Bedrooms that had once witnessed the silent migration of lovers were shuttered and cold. The name cards that had guided gentlemen to their assignations were no longer needed. The 6 o'clock bell had stopped ringing. The whole intricate machinery of the aristocratic affair had been dismantled, not by moral reform, but by economic reality and in demographic collapse. The world that had made Edward VII his kingdom of pleasure had simply ceased to exist. But the stories lived on, whispered in drawing rooms, printed in gossip columns, passed from generation to generation like a disease, and one story in particular refused to be buried. It concerned the most respectable mistress of them all, Alice Keppel, and the children she bore her husband George, or rather, the children she might have borne the king. You see, there has always been a question about the paternity of Alice Keppel's younger daughter, Sonia. Alice had 2 daughters, Violet, born in 1894, and Sonia, born in 1900. Violet was born before Alice met the Prince of Wales, so her parentage is not in doubt. But Sonia was born 2 years after Alice became the royal mistress, and her features, her coloring, her entire physical type bore a striking resemblance to the Hanoverian bloodline. The father on the birth certificate was George Keppel, the compliant husband, but those who studied the photographs, who traced the family trees, who understood the logistics of Alice's relationship with Edward, have long suspected that George was not the biological father. The rumors were never proved, No DNA test was possible, but the circumstantial evidence was strong enough that the idea took root and refused to die. Sonia Keppel grew up, married a man named Roland Cubitt, and had a daughter named Rosalind. Rosalind married a man named Bruce Shand, and they had a daughter of their own, a girl born in 1947. That girl was named Camilla. Yes, that Camilla. Camilla Shand, who would grow up to become Camilla Parker Bowles, the woman who would one day marry Prince Charles and become, in coronation if not in title, Queen of the United Kingdom. If the rumors about Sonia's paternity are true, then Camilla is not merely the wife of a king. She is the direct descendant of a king, her bloodline running straight from Edward VII through Alice Keppel and her daughter, down to the woman who now sits beside Charles III on the throne. It is an irony so rich, so perfectly circular, that it seems almost too neat to be true. And yet, the evidence, such as it is, points in that direction. This secret, if it is a secret, sat hidden in plain sight for decades. Alice Keppel never spoke of it. Sonia Keppel never acknowledged it. The royal family, for obvious reasons, had no interest in investigating the matter. But the fact remains that the current British monarchy is, by marriage, connected to the most famous royal mistress of the Edwardian era through a bloodline that may or may not be legitimate. The polite hypocrisy of the Edwardian age, the elaborate dance of discretion and denial, has echoed down through the generations and deposited its final surprise in the very heart of the modern royal family. When you look at photographs of Alice Keppel and compare them to photographs of Camilla, the resemblance is not just striking, it is almost uncanny. The same steady gaze, the same strong features, the same impression of a woman who knows exactly who she is and what she wants. The same amused tolerance for the absurdities of men. The same ability to navigate a hostile press without ever giving them what they really want. Camilla, in so many ways, is the reincarnation of Alice Keppel. A fact that the British public, which once vilified her as the other woman, has gradually come to accept with a kind of weary affection. The wheel has come full circle. The mistress, who was once the scandal of the realm, is now the ancestor of the Queen. The affair that was conducted in whispers and shadows has produced a lineage that sits on the throne. And this brings us to the final, most unsettling question of all. What did the Edwardian system of polite adultery actually accomplish? On the surface, it preserved the facade of respectability while allowing the aristocracy to indulge every appetite. It kept families intact and property consolidated. It prevented the kind of public scandals that had shaken the French and Russian monarchies. But beneath that surface, it was a machine for producing secrets, and secrets have a way of compounding over time. Each affair created a new vulnerability, a new person who knew too much, a new piece of paper that could be stolen or sold. Each child born of uncertain parentage introduced a genetic wildcard into the bloodline of the ruling class. The system that seemed so stable in 1900 was, in reality, a vast accumulation of unspoken truths, and when the pressure became too great, the truths began to leak. The Edwardian aristocracy never fully recovered from the exposure. The scandals of the 20s and 30s stripped away the mystique that had once protected the ruling class from public scrutiny. The idea that the rich and titled were inherently superior, that they deserved their privileges because they were better people, could not survive the relentless parade of adultery, divorce, and financial incompetence. The press, which had once been the handmaiden of the aristocracy, became its most effective enemy, and the public, which had once looked up to its betters with deference, learned to look at them with a mixture of prurient curiosity and moral contempt. The foundations of the class system were not eroded by revolution or legislation. They were eroded by gossip. The polite affair, that intricate mechanism of desire and discretion, was not the cause of the aristocracy's downfall, but it was the symptom of a deeper rot. The same men who conducted themselves with such elegance in the bedroom conducted the affairs of the nation with the same casual entitlement, the same assumption that the rules did not apply to them. The First World War exposed the incompetence of that generation. The Great Depression exposed their economic irrelevance, and the tabloid press exposed their private lives, not because the private lives were uniquely scandalous, but because they were the most visible symbol of a class that had failed in every other respect. The Edwardian age, for all its beauty and glamour, was a sunset, not a dawn. The real reckoning was still to come. Yet the fascination remains. We are still drawn to the stories of those country house weekends, the name cards on the doors, the 6 o'clock bell. We still read the novels and watch the television series that recreate that world in loving, nostalgic detail. There is something seductive about the sheer elegance of the hypocrisy, the way the whole system functioned like a beautifully engineered clockwork. It is easy to forget, when we are lost in the costumes and the candlelight, that real people lived and suffered in that world, that the system destroyed as many lives as it enabled, and that the price of discretion was often paid in the currency of human misery. The servants who were dismissed for their own affairs while their masters conducted theirs with impunity. The wives who were ruined by divorce courts while their husbands remarried. The children who grew up uncertain of their paternity. The mistresses who were discarded when they became inconvenient. The whole glittering edifice was built on a foundation of pain, and the pain has not been entirely erased by the passage of time. The story of Edwardian affairs, then, is not simply a story about sex. It is a story about power. Who had it, who lacked it, and how it was used. The men had the power, and they used it to construct a world in which their desires were accommodated and their reputations were protected. The women had far less power, and they used what they had to survive within a system that was stacked against them. The smartest women, the Alice Keppels, parlayed their positions into financial security and lasting influence. The less clever, the Daisy Warwicks, ended up blackmailing their former lovers and campaigning for socialism. The unlucky ones ended up in the divorce courts, publicly shamed and privately destroyed. All of them, regardless of their fate, were engaged in a negotiation that was never conducted on equal terms. The polite affair was polite only on the surface. Beneath that surface, it was a brutal exercise of power, and the bruises it left have not entirely faded even now. As the story of the Edwardian aristocracy fades into history, we are left with an inheritance that is more complicated than we sometimes acknowledge. We have inherited their houses, preserved as museums for our weekend visits. We have inherited their art, their furniture, their letters, their photographs. We have inherited their scandals transformed into entertainment for our television screens. And we have inherited their bloodlines, scattered through the modern royal family and the surviving aristocracy, carrying genetic echoes of those long-ago assassinations. The past is never really past. It lives on in the faces of the present, in the DNA of the powerful, in the stories we tell ourselves about who we are and where we came from. The Edwardian affair system was supposed to be invisible, a private matter conducted behind closed doors. Instead, it has become one of the most visible features of an age that we cannot stop, examining an age that fascinates us precisely because it was so accomplished at hiding its truths. The secrets that were meant to stay buried are now part of the historical record, and the polite hypocrites who thought they could control the narrative have been judged by a posterity that looks at them with knowing eyes and a certain amount of pity. And so we arrive at the final accounting. The world of the Edwardian affair is gone, but its legacy endures in the institutions and attitudes that shape our own time. The double standard has not disappeared. The tabloid press is still hungry. The powerful still attempt to hide their private lives behind walls of lawyers and public relations, consultants, and the question of how much the public has a right to know about the private conduct of its leaders remains as contested today as it was when the Prince of Wales first stepped into the witness box at the Tranby Croft trial. We are still wrestling with the ghosts of Edwardian England, still trying to decide whether the rules that applied to the masters should also apply to the servants, still sorting through the wreckage of a social order that collapsed under the weight of its own contradictions. What we can say with certainty is this: the Edwardian aristocracy perfected the art of the affair because they had to. They were trapped in a system that demanded public virtue while forbidding private freedom, and the affair was their escape valve. It allowed them to live lives of emotional and physical richness within the narrow confines of their class obligations. It was, in its own twisted way, a form of liberation, but it was a liberation that depended on the collaboration of everyone involved. And when that collaboration broke down, the liberation became a trap. The women who had thought themselves free discovered that they were only free as long as no one talked. The men who had thought themselves invulnerable discovered that they could be brought low by a letter or a trial. The whole system was a house of cards, and the wind that knocked it down was the simple, inevitable force of truth. The final image we should hold in our minds is not the grand country house or the elegant drawing room. It is the darkened corridor, the name card glowing faintly in the candlelight, the figure of a gentleman moving silently toward a door that will open to admit him to a world of pleasure and risk. That figure believed he was safe. He believed the rules would protect him. He believed that what happened behind closed doors would stay there forever. He was wrong, and his descendants, whether they know it or not, are still living with the consequences of his mistake. Because in the end, every secret has a way of surfacing. Every closed door eventually opens, and when it does, the light that floods in can be merciless. The Edwardian age learned that lesson the hard way, and we are still learning it today. Every time another scandal breaks, every time another powerful man discovers that the rules he thought did not apply to him, apply to everyone in the end. Now, as we prepare to leave this world behind, consider the strange, looping path we have traveled. From the bedroom corridors of country houses to the divorce courts of London, from the whispering servants to the screaming tabloid headlines, from the king's deathbed to the coronation of his descendant's wife, a woman who may carry the king's own blood in her veins. The story of the Edwardian affair is a story that refuses to end, a story that keeps reaching forward into the present, tapping us on the shoulder, reminding us that the past is never finished with us. As you drift off tonight, think about the secrets that might be hiding in your own family tree, the whispered stories, the unexplained resemblances, the letters that were burned before anyone could read them. Every family has its shadows. The only difference between the Edwardian aristocracy and the rest of us is that their shadows were cast on a larger stage, and the light that eventually exposed them was brighter than anything they could have imagined. That light never really dimmed. Once the door was opened, it stayed open, and the generations that followed have been living in its glare ever since. We see it in the way we consume the private lives of public figures, the endless appetite for royal scandal, the tabloid headlines that still scream from the checkout aisle. We see it in the way a photograph of a princess or a rumor about a prince can dominate the global news cycle for weeks. The Edwardian aristocracy thought they were masters of their own narrative, that they could separate the public performance from the private truth and never let the two collide. They were wrong, and we, their inheritors, are still sorting through the collision. What makes the Edwardian affair system so endlessly fascinating is not just the sex, not just the glamour, but the audacity of its organization. These were people who turned infidelity into a form of hospitality, who mapped romantic liaisons onto floor plans with the same care they devoted to seating arrangements. At dinner, they understood human desire not as a force to be repressed, but as a logistical challenge. to be managed, a current to be channeled. And for a brief, glittering moment they managed it. The name cards on the doors, the 6 o'clock bell, the silent servants, the husbands and lovers playing bridge together in the evening after sharing a bed. It was a masterpiece of social engineering, a testament to what can be achieved when an entire class decides to cooperate in the maintenance of a shared illusion. But illusions have their limits. The system worked only as long as everyone agreed to play by the same rules, and the moment someone refused, the moment a Daisy Warwick talked too much, or a Lady Charles Beresford got angry, or a newspaper editor decided that scandal was more profitable than deference, the whole beautiful machine began to grind. The tragedy, and it is a tragedy, is that the people who suffered most when it ground were not the architects of the system, but the people who had been forced to live within it, the servants who were dismissed for the same behavior their masters enjoyed, the wives who were ruined in divorce courts while their husbands remarried, the children who grew up uncertain of their parentage or their place, the mistresses who were discarded when their usefulness ended. The system was elegant, but it was also cruel, and the elegance has a way of obscuring the cruelty when we look back on it. Through the soft focus of nostalgia, we are still prone to that nostalgia. We watch the period dramas and read the historical novels. We tour the country houses and imagine ourselves in that world, moving through the candlelit corridors with our own secrets. But nostalgia is a selective filter. It removes the damp, the cold, the disease, the rigid constraints, the suffocating hypocrisy. It remembers the silk gowns and forgets the lice. It remembers the wit and forgets the desperation. The Edwardian era was, for all its aesthetic appeal, a time of profound inequality, and the affair system was a product of that inequality. It was a luxury available only to those with the resources to maintain it, the houses with enough bedrooms, the servants who could be counted on to keep silent, the lawyers who could be paid to suppress the letters. It was, in the end, another privilege of wealth and rank, like the great estates themselves, and like the great estates, it could not survive the democratization of the 20th century. And yet, it endures in the most unexpected ways. Consider the modern royal family, which has spent the last century trying to distance itself from the specter of Edwardian decadence, only to find that specter embedded in its own genetic and marital history. The man who would be king gave up his throne for a woman the establishment considered unsuitable. His great-nephew married a woman whose great-grandmother may have been the king's own daughter. The bloodline of Edward VII, the man who normalized the royal affair, now runs through the veins of the woman who sits beside the current king. It is a twist of history so perfectly symmetrical that it feels almost scripted, a final, quiet joke, at the expense of everyone who ever tried to keep the family tree pruned and proper. The past, as we have seen, has a way of surfacing. It flows beneath the tidy lawns of the present, and every so often it breaks through. This is the lingering question that the Edwardian affair system leaves us. Not whether they were right or wrong, but whether we have truly moved beyond them. Have we outgrown the double standard, or have we simply given it new forms? Are we any less hypocritical now, or have we just gotten better at compartmentalizing? The powerful still seek privacy, the press still seeks exposure, and the public still consumes the resulting spectacle with an appetite that has not diminished in 100 years. The technology has changed. The tabloids have become websites. The letters have become text messages. The gossip has become trending hashtags. But the underlying dynamic, the tension between what we do in private and what we present in public, remains as potent as it was when Edward VII first began filling country houses with his friends and their carefully arranged accommodations. Perhaps that is why we keep telling these stories, not because they are distant and exotic, but because they are uncomfortably familiar. The Edwardians were not so different from us. They wanted love, pleasure, companionship, and they wanted to keep their reputations intact. They wanted to have their cake and eat it too, and they wanted no one to see the crumbs. We may not use name cards and 6 o'clock bells anymore, but we have our own systems of discretion, our own unspoken arrangements, our own ways of keeping certain truths behind closed doors. The difference is that we have had 100 years of practice, and the doors are made of different materials now, but they still creak open eventually. They always do, as you let your mind drift. Consider the quiet hum of a country house in the early hours of the morning. The corridors are dark, the servants are asleep. Somewhere, a floorboard creaks as a gentleman makes his way back to his own room. His collar loose, his shoes in his hand. The name card on the door he leaves behind is still in its brass holder, the ink slightly smudged. In a few hours, a maid will come to light the fire, and she will notice nothing, or she will pretend to notice nothing, which is the same thing in the end. The lady inside will wake to the smell of fresh coffee and the sound of birdsong, and she will dress for breakfast as though the night had never happened. She will sit across the table from her husband, who will ask her if she slept well, and she will say yes, thank you, and then she will pass the marmalade, and no one will ever speak of it again. That was the arrangement, that was the art, that was the world we have been exploring. Thank you for spending this time with me, slipping into the hidden rooms of Edwardian history. If the quiet rhythm of these stories helped ease your mind towards sleep, consider leaving a like and subscribing. It tells the algorithm that there is still an audience for slow, immersive history, the kind that unfolds without rushing, the kind that honors the complexity of the past. Drop a comment and let me know where you are listening from and what time it is for you. I always enjoy seeing the map of listeners spread across the globe, each in their own darkness, sharing a story. Until next time, rest well. The past will still be here when you wake, waiting with its secrets and its shadows, patient as always,